turn off your lights.
Hey, stay on it, stay on it.
Turn your flashers.
Not good, not good.
A lot of lightning, I need lightning. Stop.
Hey, let's get on that road. Oh, wait, is that a road that goes east?
There's a car coming behind us.
Yeah,
You
we're
might
gonna go
turn your lights. Lights on. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a live severe weather briefing with a case study on the prolific April 15, 2011 tornado outbreak with well over 100 tornadoes reported across Dixie Alley all the way up to southern Illinois. And this outbreak is in a lot of ways forgotten, or at least overshadowed by the super outbreak that happened less than 2 weeks later on April 27, 2011. But just 2 weeks before that, this was a substantial, even historic tornado outbreak, and it left behind damaged tracks that we were actually crossing while we were chasing the supercells from the super outbreak 2 weeks later. So we were chasing EF4, EF5 tornadoes, and they were actually crisscrossing damage paths from this outbreak. And this outbreak began in the relatively early in the day, in the late morning. The tornado at the bottom left, that's an EF3 tornado that tore through Clinton, Mississippi. We intercepted that tornado just before 11 o'clock in the morning. It crossed I-20 near the Clinton area. And then we also intercepted a much later wave just after sunset. That's the video down below me there. That's also an EF3 tornado that tore through Leakesville, Mississippi, and we were chasing that tornado. Called in the report, and the emergency manager, Trent Robertson, who's a good friend of mine, he was actually the one that sounded the tornado siren in that town. That saved a lot of lives. It came in after dark. We'll break down the radar as well. The radar loop that you see in the background, that's actually from the Leakesville tornado as well. And there were 146 tornado reports during this outbreak. So an absolutely insane outbreak that happened here. And I'm going to begin just by showing you a quick radar loop of that Leakesville tornado, since I already have it in the background. And this was the later wave. So there were several different modes to this outbreak. There was the late morning into early afternoon mode that was near the Jackson, Mississippi area with the EF3. That cluster of supercells spread into west central Alabama by afternoon, producing several tornadoes there as well. And then a late afternoon into evening mode developed across southern Mississippi, and that's the one that you're seeing here. That lead supercell is the Leakesville storm. That crossed into Alabama and continued to produce tornadoes there. I'll show you that video as well just a little bit later, when we break down all those individual tornadoes. And this tornado outbreak was actually part of a 3-day outbreak that began the day before across the southern plains. You may remember the Tushka outbreak, the Tushka, Oklahoma outbreak that was down here, or Tushka, Oklahoma tornado. It was a large multiple vortex wedge there. We actually missed that tornado. I was a little bit further north, just north of the I-40 corridor on that storm, which produced a couple weak tornadoes, but I missed the really big one down near Tushka, Oklahoma, in the southeast part of the state. Almost looked like a smaller version of the El Reno tornado with big suction vortices rotating all the way around it. And we were so upset that we missed that tornado that we drove all night long. There were a couple tornadoes there in western Arkansas that happened overnight, even some in central Arkansas. And then we dropped down here to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and we noticed there was a dominant storm in the early morning, probably even 7 or 8 in the morning, that was across northern Louisiana, just trucking. It had slightly deviant motion as well, so you knew it was trying to develop a mesocyclone. And we just waited right at the Mississippi River for that supercell to cross, and it put down a brief tornado between Vicksburg and Clinton, and then the EF3 at about 11 a.m. in Clinton, just to the north side of Jackson. And then that cluster of supercells went on to produce many more tornadoes across west central Alabama. And then the later mode developed across southern Mississippi, and that's what these tornadoes are here. And that includes the Leakesville EF3 tornado as well. And then the day after, the Carolina Piedmont went crazy with a bunch of tornadoes across central North Carolina, even into Virginia. The Raleigh area had a bunch of dangerous tornadoes. around it. We'll break down those in a separate case study, but today we're focused on the April 15 portion of this outbreak, which was basically in central portions of Dixie Alley there. And here are the reports, and they spread all the way up north into southern Illinois, and we'll show you why there were tornadoes up there as well. But 146 reports from this event. As far north as central Illinois, that was more of a high wind shear, low cape type of a setup. Even these were more high shear, low cape, but a very strong wind shear up in central Illinois that led to a textbook high shear, low cape type setup. But look at all these long tracks down here, beginning in the late morning hours, just to the north of Jackson, and that storm continued all the way across northern Alabama, producing a wedge even at times over there in Alabama by early afternoon. There was another supercell that developed to the south of that one that crossed into west central Alabama. And then you've got the Leakesville tornado down here. That's the furthest south mode. That was just after sunset. These were also very late overnight, the night of the 15th there. And there was even a tornado northwest of Baton Rouge out there in Louisiana. So here's what the surface map looks like. You can see a pretty occluded surface low up there lifting through the portions of the Midwest. Eastern Kansas there is where the surface low, kind of a double-barreled banana shape. This is the occluded portion of the front right there, so it's largely a vertically stacked low. The 500 millibar low was closed and was oriented directly above that surface low. And here is the warm sector. Actually, you had a main warm front that lifted north of the Ohio River Valley, and then this warm front down here is the boundary of the deeper moisture, and then a cold front was marching east toward the Mississippi River Valley. Usually you want to target, with these Dixie Alley setups, the best overlap of instability and wind shear, and often you have a subtropical connection and a pretty strong low-level jet that extends pretty far south in the warm sector, even if the parent surface low is lifting off to the north pretty fast. But this is an incredibly dynamic system at 500 millibars. See how it's vertically stacked? That's the upper level low. Closed off at 500, but still has a slight negative tilt to it. So this system is definitely intensifying as it progressed across the plains and into Dixie Alley. Trough axis somewhat like that, so that's a negative tilt, goes from the northwest off to the southeast. And a big time jet streak was along the base of the trough across Dixie Alley, and you can see how these winds are largely out of the west, and that caused the supercells to move more of a west southwest to east northeast direction, and with a due south southwest to north northeast low level jet, that created pretty incredible critical angles for Dixie Alley. Normally those critical angles are more in the 60-degree range for these outbreaks, but that one in Dixie Alley, critical angles were even close to 90 degrees, and you had a big 40-knot 0 to 1 kilometer shear vector as well. But this was largely a closed off low by this time. So the system had intensified as it ejected across the plains. That's why you had so many tornadoes across Oklahoma the day before on the 14th. And then here it reached its peak, became vertically stacked. The low-level surface low became occluded, as we mentioned, which is when the cold air overtakes the warm air. A similar thing happens on the mesoscale and storm scale with an occluded tornado cyclone as it becomes separated from the mesocyclone, decoupled, and then will rope out the dry air wrapping around it. The subsiding air will choke off that tornado from the vacuum cleaner like mesocyclone, causing it to weaken. On the synoptic scale, you can see similarities when a system becomes vertically stacked or occluded like this one. But this is definitely a big system. 80 knot, 500 millibar jet surging across the lower Mississippi River Valley right there. Looking at the low-level jet, even though there's not a lot of data points, you can see a 40 to 50 knot low-level jet in the warm sector, as you'd expect with a big-time system like this. The low-level jet was focused by late afternoon across eastern Mississippi, and then you had a more back to the level jet across southern and central Illinois there with a southeasterly oriented 1 kilometer wind, and that generated a lot of wind shear up there across the northern mode, which was just a textbook high wind shear, low cape type of a scenario. But down here in the heart of Dixie Alley, you had the perfect balance of big cape, 1,500 to 2,000, even 3,000 cape in the southern end of Dixie Alley. Very strong low-level jet. We'll look at the hodograph next and break that down, the Jackson hodograph at 12Z. And you remember that the tornadoes happened relatively early in the day, late morning. So this is the 12Z sounding on April 15th, which is pretty representative of the tornadic environment. Let's see if I can find this hodograph. And then we'll break down the meso-analysis as well, show all the maps of wind shear, the significant tornado parameter, composite indices like the energy helicity index. But first, this was the Jackson sounding at 12Z. You already had a big elevated mix layer coming in here at the mid-levels. That's dry air. You can see as the dew point curve decreases and becomes further separated from the red line, which is the temperature. You're getting bigger temperature dew point spreads. That leads to increased cape. You get steeper lapse rates. The temperatures cool with height a bit faster and dry air like that, and that increases the cape right here, which is this area between the parcel temperature and the environmental temperature. There was a little bit of cooler air aloft here, but I doubt that that's even accurate. Almost looks like there could have been a little bit of a cirrus stack coming in at the high levels there, but really what sticks out is this big elevated mix layer right here. And look at this low-level jet. You've got 50 knots out of the south-southwest just ripping. You've got south-southeast surface winds. And you remember how we looked aloft at the base of the trough. You had largely due westerly mid and upper level winds out in this area at the upper level winds. And that would bring the right moving supercell down in this area right here because of those upper level winds. And on the hodograph, that creates basically a 90-degree angle between the 0 to 1 kilometer shear vector and the storm motion vector there. That's the critical angle. So these storms were taken in purely streamwise vorticity. Your surface wind, you can see here almost due south at 20 knots. 1 kilometer up, you've got a 50-knot low-level jet just west of due south. And the hodograph is connecting the lines between those different wind vectors at the different levels, plotted out. And when you've got this big hook like that, a hook-shaped hodograph, that means that there's going to be a lot of storm relative helicity within there. Between the storm motion vector and the hodograph curve, that area totaled up, that's the storm relative helicity, which we're going to be looking at maps here in a little bit. The 0 to 1 kilometer helicity, almost 400 right there by this sounding. So that's that area that I just highlighted in the hodograph. That's definitely sufficient for strong tornadoes, even in the morning hours. And that's why there were tornadoes by late morning just to the north of Jackson in the Clinton area. And I'll show you that video in just a little bit here. But first, we got to break down the environment even more. Here is that storm relative helicity across the warm sector. And you can see across central Illinois, you have 400 to 500 0 to 1 kilometer helicities up there. Pretty far north. That's why you had those tornadoes all the way up there into central Illinois. That's usually not a bad target during these big Dixie events up in Illinois because the storm chasing terrain is so favorable up there. So this is because of that back low-level jet. So just to the northeast of the occluded surface low, the low-level jet was southeast to northwest, a kilometer up. And with storm motions, more meridional or due south to north, you really needed that southeasterly low-level jet to get a hodograph favorable for tornadoes. But you had storms that would initiate off of this arc, which is an arc-shaped cold front. You basically want to target the apex of that arc up there, and you often get an arc of low-top supercells moving from south to north with a backed low-level jet, and that's why you had tornadoes up there. But then look at the southern mode. You had big helicities down here, 300 to 400, 500 even over a port near the Alabama-Mississippi border, and that big wind shear extended down to the south especially toward evening. You had an enhancement even of that low-level shear as the low-level jet, the southern portion of that low-level jet accelerated even more. And that's why after we intercepted the first tornado in late morning, we tried to keep up with them. They were moving pretty fast. But we decided to go after this nocturnal mode in southern Mississippi, and that's when we got on the EF3 tornado near Leakesville. So here is the Cape, and you can see a skinny Cape axis all the way up into Illinois there. Surface-based instability with no convective inhibition, high wind shear. And so even though the EHIs may have been a bit marginal up into central Illinois, the wind shear was so extreme that it compensated, more than compensated for limitations in that in the instability. And you had plenty of surface-based instability, very backed low-level winds up there. So that would have been a decent target. If you're already living in central Illinois, you may have targeted this area during this outbreak. A lot of times these big outbreaks in Dixie Alley are bimodal, with a northern mode up here and then a southern mode further south, where you have a little bit more instability down south, maybe a slightly weaker wind shear. In this case, you had big wind shear in both modes. And then the northern mode is often a little bit more marginal in terms of the instability, but big time wind shear up there. And then usually in between, you get a relative minimum in the tornado reports. And that's exactly what happened on April 15, 2011. The northern mode, if you prefer wind shear with limited Cape. Southern mode, you have more Cape and you also have good wind shear. The terrain along the Mississippi River Valley is decent storm chasing terrain, not a lot of trees out there. But then you get a lot of trees east of the I-55 corridor, closer to the Alabama border, but still there are open areas out there and a greater number of storms. So you can always hop to different clusters of supercells through Dixie Alley, even though it's very difficult to keep up with those individual storms. So here's the EHI, and as I mentioned, the EHI a lot of times underdoes the tornadic environments of those high wind shear, low Cape type setups like what we saw on this day in central Illinois. You can see the 0 to 1 kilometer energy helicity index only on the order of 1 to 2, but that's because Cape and wind shear are given equal weights in the energy helicity index. And so I think that Cape is just a little bit more heavily favored. You can definitely see the Cape axis here in the energy helicity index. But really, it should weight wind shear a little bit more heavily, and then you'd see a mode pop out in central Illinois there with the big-time wind shear and more limited thermodynamics. But this does show that the most favorable combination of thermodynamics and wind shear happened down there in central and eastern southern Mississippi, and eventually spreading into western Alabama with that warm front. And these are all at about 21Z. These maps. Here's a significant tornado parameter, another composite index, which really picks up on that Cape as well, the Cape axis further south, and it really shows the strong tornado potential, the EF3s that happened down near Leakesville in southeastern Mississippi. So it definitely did a good job at picking out where those strong tornadoes would happen. There was the EF3 on the north side of Jackson, the EF3 near Leakesville. I believe there were some strong tornadoes, at least a bunch of EF2s across western Alabama as well. So here is the radar image of that Leakesville tornado. This is from the National Weather Service Mobile site. And you can certainly see the debris ball there at the end of it. On reflectivity, you can see some big time velocity as well. Just a textbook bean shaped Dixie Alley. It had relatively low reflectivity when we first got on this storm, probably 40 dBz or so, but had this perfect bean shape, that tight gradient on the reflectivity on the south side just to the north of the tornado along that forward flank gust front. And you can really see a very in excess of 100 knots gate-to-gate shear with this tornado as well. And now I'm going to show you the video from the Leakesville event. Here it is. You can see it was at night, but you could see the tornado with the naked eye a lot better than this video picks up. But there you can see it in the lightning strikes. Big tornado that was moving back and forth across the road. So I'll show you on the damage track map that this tornado was parallel in the road that heads from southwest to northeast into Leakesville. And there was pretty frequent lightning with this storm, thankfully, but you could see the tornado easily with the naked eye. If I had better camera equipment, you certainly would have seen the whole thing. You could see rapid, violent motion as well. It was changing shape, multiple vortices popping in and out, debris coming out of the sky in the backside of this tornado. There you can see one of those power flashes. And then we came into Leakesville, saw a bunch of damage. Gas station was trying to find these radar loops. There it is. So there you can see a fire, a transformer that was hit by the tornado, and that caused an explosion that illuminated the whole entire tornado as well. But we did a hook slice maneuver with this storm from southwest to northeast. We were staying behind the tornado. That's important when you're chasing Dixie Alley because you can always stop the vehicle as a viable escape route, allowing the tornado to move off to the northeast. And in this case, we could see the tornado clearly from the southwest side. Trees were down, some debris coming out of the sky. So here is the radar loop of the Leakesville storm. This is the same radar loop that I began with, and you can see that lead storm of this southern wave. It passed just to the north of the Mobile, Alabama area. This is the first tornado that I saw in Alabama, I think, too. I had seen a few in Dixie Alley before this, quite a few, but you can see how that storm was. Probably had 40 dBz, but perfect shape right there, moving almost due west to east. Later on, the upper level winds became even more westerly with time. And here is the detailed damage track map. And you can see the road southwest to northeast into Leakesville. This one right here. You can't see it because of the damage. The yellow there, I believe, is EF3 rating, and this was given an EF3 there in Leakesville. But this is the road we were on, and we came out of a national forest, had no data, and then bam, cone tornado right in front of us, zigzagging back and forth across this road, and then eventually hitting Leakesville head on, across the border into Alabama, producing some substantial damage as well to the north. Here is the Clinton track. This is the EF3 tornado that we intercepted in late morning, and you can see that it crossed Interstate 20 to the west of Jackson, near the Clinton area. And this is where that first area where it crossed I-20, that's where we intercepted that tornado. And now I can show you the video of that tornado as it was crossing I-20. In the morning hours. So this is in Clinton as the tornado was about to cross I-20. This was also given an EF3. You could certainly see the vertical motion in there. A lot of updraft in this tornado. That means it had a low swirl ratio, which means it was acting more as a vacuum cleaner with less rotational motion to it. But this tornado, as I mentioned, was rated an EF3 as well. You'll see some power flashes here as it was crossing the road. There were even some motorists that were heading to work in the morning hours. You'll see that minivan there that did an evasive U-turn on the overpass there to get out of the path of this strong tornado. Look at them right there, passing from close range. We could have launched rockets into this tornado easily. I'm looking to the south as that tornado is moving from west to east. That's probably the tornado at peak intensity. Stout condensation, suction all the way to the ground. But this was the initial wave, so several different modes of this prolific outbreak. And probably one of a more successful tornado intercepts out there as well. And also in reporting the tornado, the Leakesville EF3, the sounding of that siren shows the direct connection between storm chasers and emergency personnel that sound those sirens, sound the tornado sirens that send out the warning. So this is my case study on April 15. Definitely a big time outbreak, probably the second most prolific outbreak I've ever chased in Dixie Alley, behind the super outbreak that happened only 12 days after this, which we've already done a case study for. But this is a major outbreak, and I think we're going to probably see similar severe weather, even tornado outbreaks this early spring, late winter into early spring across Dixie Alley, especially once that moisture is a little bit further north, pooled up further north in the Gulf of Mexico. But thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy these case studies. And I'll keep pumping these out, a couple of these a week. We'll keep plotting photographs, keep dominating live streams, and have a good rest of your Thursday, and we'll keep going live every single day. Thank you. Never stop chasing.